Welcome to this RootsTech session, a deep dive into the U.S. Census records being broadcast from the Expo Hall with Miles A. Meyer. Miles is a scientist by training and an active genealogist for over 25 years. His expertise revolves around new technologies, internet research, and family search. He is the principal researcher for Our Ancestry's Genealogy, a family history consultant and current director of the Vero Beach, Florida Family Search Center. He is also the director of education for the Family History Guide. I'll turn it over to you, Miles.
Okay, there we go. Now we've got audio. As was mentioned, we're going to take a deep dive into the U.S. Census. One thing to remember when you're looking at the census is that you can't take the information in the census as final proof. You need to find other resources in order to back that up. We'll talk about some of the problems with reading the censuses and the information that's in them as we go through this talk today. So when we start looking at the census, we have to realize what information we're going to find in those censuses. The first U.S. Census was in 1790, when the U.S. population was about 3.9 million people. Between 1790 and 1840, the only names that were recorded in those censuses were the heads of households, and we had those little tick marks that ended up giving us the age classes that individuals within that household were in. In 1850, we had our first enumeration where we list all the members of the household. 1850 was also the first slave schedule. One thing to realize about the 1850 census is that just because somebody is listed in the household does not mean that they're necessarily related. It does not give the relationships of those individuals. In 1860 was the first census where American Indians were specifically counted. And so the US population was about 31.4 million people at that time, and the Indian population was recorded about 40,000. In 1890, that's the census we all wish we had. That was destroyed in 1921 in a fire, and so there are remnants. There's about 6,100 pages of that census that still remain, and we'll talk about where those pages are currently at. And then the 1950 census is the most recent census, and that was about 150.7 million people recorded. When we look at the census, we need to understand the terminology or the intent of the questions. So each of those questions, there's a large description about each of those questions in the enumerators, indexes, or instruction manuals. And so you want to understand why those questions were asked and what was the intent of those questions. And we also need to know about the dates of the census. Just because there's a date written on the census, that doesn't mean that that's the official date the census began or the date that the information is relevant to. So I have a couple websites here, the National Archives and the IPUMS websites. All of these, the slides are all downloadable. And if you download the slides, there's an extra 50 slides at the end of the program that has more information about the 1950 census. So it's a little bonus if you download the slides. Also, all of the links are in the syllabus, so you can find those easily there. The enumeration date is the date of the as of for that census. So as of this date, that's the information that's current. So the census may say the census was the enumerator took the information on July 15th, but if the enumeration date was April 1st, anything that happened between April 1st and July 15th was not recorded in that census. So if a child was born, that child would not be in that census or should not be in that census. If a family moved during that period of time, they should not be in that census, okay? So again, it's the as of. It'll record the residents as of that date. It'll record the ages as of that date and the family members residing in that household as of that date. So you can see that the date changes depending on what census decade you're looking at. So in the 1790 census, it was August 2nd. In the 1950 census, it was April 1st. So just realize that. This table is on the Family Search Wiki, so I provided the link there so you can have that sitting at your desk while you're looking at your census so you can figure out where that information comes from. And usually when we're doing census work, we start with the most recent census and we work our way back. So you're going to find the people you know in the 1950 census, and then you're going to move them back to 1940 and 1930 and so on. But if you're researching somebody who came across the sea and was an immigrant, and you know when they immigrated, you might want to start at that first immigration census. What was the first census after they immigrated? And then work forward to see if you can track them. So maybe you're researching your great-grandfather's brother and he immigrated in 1923. You're going to find him in the 1930 census. So maybe look in that 1930 census to see if you can find him there. And you want to develop a search strategy. You want to know who you're looking for. Who is in that family? What are the family members you expect to see in that decade of that census? You want to have an idea about the location where they may have lived. And you want to know their approximate ages and birth dates so you can compare the families across the census record with the information that you already know. Now, this talk I gave yesterday was on voting records. And I explained how voting records can fill in the gaps between these censuses. And it can give you an idea if somebody moved between censuses. So that recording is available online on the RootsTech website. And if you want to watch that, you can pick that up later. If you can't find them in the census, you want to try searching that last name throughout that region, in that area, and see if anybody else with that last name shows up. You want to try various spellings. I'll show you some examples of some really poor spellings in the census. You also want to look at the names that are listed in the census and who's living in that household, okay? So they may list relatives, in-laws, cousins, children. And when you're looking at the names of those individuals, you want to try to think about how they are related when you're looking at that. People who moved into an area or were born in an area or born between that enumeration date and that the census taker's date won't show up, or they should not show up. But the enumerators did not always follow instructions. So sometimes you won't find them at all because the one enumerator followed the instruction and the other one didn't. Or the enumerator said, well, they're here now, I'll write them down. And so you'll find them twice in the same census. How many people have found them twice in the same census? Yeah. And you're like, which one are they? So you have to be careful about where you're finding them. They could have been missed entirely. They may have just walked past that house, nobody was home. They didn't go back and check it later. Or they may have asked the neighbor and said, who's this? And the neighbor's like, well, I think it's so-and-so. They just moved in April, don't know them very well. So be aware of that. You also want to check the various spellings and misspellings. So the enumerator may have made an error. He may have misunderstood how it was spelled, or he may have misspelled it. My name, Meyer. I went to school with a bunch of Meyers. There's 5 different ways of spelling Meyer in my high school. So they could have easily misspelled it. Or the people doing the indexing or the transcribing might have missed it. They might have misspelled it. When you're looking for the census, realize that not everybody uses the same image. So Family Search might have a really great image of the census, and Ancestry might have a poor image of that same page. Or Fold3, or MyHeritage, or Find My Past. So if you have a problem seeing or reading the image on one of those databases, go to the other database and see how their image looks. So here's an example. The one on the left is from Ancestry, from the 1860 census, and the one on the right is the exact same page from Fold3. Which one would you rather be reading? The Ancestry, of course. So the Ancestry one listed the person's name as Frank Sisterheiden, and the Fold3 listed as Frank Lesterheiden, and his real name is Frank Westerheide. Does anybody see a W in that word, in that name? There's absolutely no W there. So the only way I was able to find him was I went page by page and I looked at all of the family members that should have been in that family. And I found Frank, Elizabeth, John, Mary. And I'm like, this is the family. Because there's no Lesterheidens or Sisterheidens there. In the 1800 and 1810 census, you may find the census in almost alphabetical order. This page is all A's, this page is all B's. Well, the enumerator still went around door to door. They didn't pick people up by alphabetical order. What you're seeing there is the second copy of the census. So the enumerator went through, he recorded people as he saw them, and then that first copy stayed with the county or the state. They made a second copy, and in that second copy, they went through and alphabetically put everybody in almost alphabetical order. And so you'll see a difference in some of these censuses that way. And so they'll turn that into to the federal government as the record for that census. So when you see that, realize that's not the first copy. So somebody could have copied the information incorrectly. Now, we all know about this 1890 census being missing, but how many of you know about the other censuses that are missing? Many of the early censuses are incomplete. For example, 1790 is missing Delaware, Georgia, New Jersey, and Virginia. Big sections of the early United States. 1800, we see a lot more states and territories that are missing. 1810, additional areas. What's interesting is you see that Illinois territory had 2 counties, St. Clair and Randolph. St. Clair is missing. So the one county in Illinois, when they only had 2 counties, 1 county is missing. 1820, we see some more missing territories and states and partial losses in counties of Alabama and Tennessee. 1830, we have countywide losses in Massachusetts, Maryland, and Mississippi. And then 1890, most of it was destroyed, leaving a little over 6,100 pages surviving. And those are individual sets of pages for locations in Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, and South Dakota, Texas, and District of Columbia. What's really bad is how many of you have seen the 1890 census? That census has a lot of questions on it, and it's very, very detailed. So if you ever found your family in this, each person had an entire column of questions on the front and back of the sheet. So if you were lucky enough to be in one of those locations, Ohio, I think, has like 10 pages on Cincinnati or something like that. Other than that, you're out of luck. So let's talk specifically about where you're going to find information within these censuses. First of all, if you're looking for birth dates, those early, before the 1850 census, those tick marks, okay? You have to understand what each of those columns are for, what they mean, because they're age classes. There's the male age classes, the female age classes, and so on. If you can put those all together, you have the 1790 and 1800 and 1810, all of those age classes are a little bit different in each census record. And so when you put those together, you might find a 2 or 3 year gap where that tick mark constantly shows up. And then that'll help you figure out the birth for that location. The 1840 census has a specific line in there for Revolutionary War veterans, pensioners. So if you have a person who's a Revolutionary War pensioner and was still alive in 1840, do the math. That's 60 years after the Revolutionary War. So he's in his 70s, late 70s, 80s probably. They would have his name and his age written in the 1840 census. Most of the other censuses, you see the families listed there or the members of the household and their ages. When you're looking at that, remember that age is plus or minus a few years. We have one individual, he aged between 5 and 7 years in every census that he was in. His wife aged 10 years. So she was much older than him by the end of the censuses. And his children were almost as old as him when they left the house. So. And then we have like the 1870 and 1880 census, where if they were born during that year, they'll list the month of their birth. Again, be a little cautious of it. It says, if it says March, it might be, January, but it's in that time frame a little bit. And then you'll see some of them that will list how many months, 3/12 or something like that for young children. We can also find the place of birth. So prior to the 1850 census, the tick marks, they don't give you any information on place of birth. But after that, they give you the location, the state or the country of birth. And in later censuses, they give you the parent's place of birth. So now you have that information, and it helps you find whether or not they're immigrants, whether they moved from one state to another state, where their parents came from. And then always look to see if your family is in the supplemental questions in the 1940 and 1950 census. My mother is in the 1950 census in the supplemental line. That's really great, except she was 3 years old. So it means absolutely nothing because she didn't have a job. She was never married. She had no children. She had no education. So all of that line was blank for her. You can also find your marriage dates in the census. So you can find in the 1850 to 1880 census whether they were married within that year. Now remember, that's within the year of the enumeration. So if it's April 1st, it's the year before April 1st. If it's June, it's the year before June. Okay. In the 1900 and 1910 censuses, it lists the number of years they were married for each person. So the husband may be married 12 years and the wife is married 6 years. Well, what does that mean? Well, he was married prior to that marriage. In some of the later censuses, it'll say age at first marriage. And so when you start looking at that, it just says, she was 19, he was 26, and they're both 30, So she was married several years for a while and then remarried later. So make sure you're looking at those specific pieces of information. If you see M1 or M2 in the marriage column, that means that they were married once or twice. If you see M3, my wife's dad was married 10 times. So he was not in those censuses though. So we didn't see that yet. You can also find out the number of children. So when we're looking at the earlier censuses before 1840, you can count those tick marks and you can say, well, those are probably children, but they might not be. They might be cousins, nephews, nieces. They may be, having other family members living in the household. When you get to the 1850 census, you can say, well, they all have the same last name. Probably children, maybe. But beyond that, after that point in time, they start listing the relationships, and you can see son, daughter, and so on. And so you can see that the number of children there. Between the 1900 and 1910 census lists the number of children born to the mother and the number still living. This is really great because I do a lot of rural communities research, and it may say 10 children born, 6 living. And you're like, I only have 6 children. Who are these other 4? When I wrote my grandmother's obituary, I wrote that she had a sister who died in infancy, and the family was like, no, absolutely not. I said, I have a census here, said she had 15 children, 14 still living. So there's a child missing. I had to go find that birth record and that death record, and I found the child died 2 days after she was born. The family had no idea about that. And again, look in those supplemental records also. So the supplemental records for those 2 to 5 individuals on a page for 1940 and 1950. You can also find immigration information. Most of the time, this is found easily enough in that they were born in Germany or they were born in Ireland. And so you can see that, or their parents were born in Ireland or Germany. One thing that people miss a lot is when you look at the children may be born in Ireland, New Jersey. And like, okay, when did they immigrate? Well, when was the last child born in Ireland? When was the first child born in the United States? There's your narrow gap of when they most likely immigrated. When you look at some of the other censuses, it'll list the year of immigration and the year of naturalization in 1920. So now you have an idea of when they were naturalized and when they immigrated. Again, how many people have looked at that number in multiple censuses and you see, oh, they immigrated in 1891, great. Next census, 1893. Next census, 1890. Okay. Well, it's in that range, so you narrow it down a little bit. Between 1900 and 1940, you saw the census listing the naturalization status. AL for alien, PA for the first papers, and NA for naturalized. So now you can check their status, and you can find the papers that are associated with that status. The census also gives you their military service records information. So as I mentioned, in 1840, if they were a Revolutionary War veteran pensioner, they would have their name listed there and indicate their age. 1910 lists the Civil War veterans. And so it may say UA or CA for Union or Confederate Army, or UN and CN for Union and Confederate Navy. So that'll be listed there. A lot of times you'll see numbers listed over top of that, 2100 or something like that. That's for statistical purposes only. It has nothing to do with the military service. When you start looking at the 1930 and 1940 and 1950 censuses, then they get into the specific conflict that the individual was involved in. It could be the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Philippines insurrection, the Boxer Revolution or Rebellion, the Mexican expedition, World War I, World War II, and so on. So you want to look at that far column. If it just says WW, that's World War I, because World War II hadn't happened yet. The one thing I really like is the 1940 supplemental. If you have a child listed in that supplemental line and his father was a veteran, it will say child of a veteran. And so now you have another clue for the military service. We can also look at property ownership. So you very seldom see this, but in the 1790 census, there were questions about their ownership. Did they live in a house or a store? If they lived in a store, they probably lived on the second floor of the store. They ran the store, the butcher shop, or whatever it was. You very seldom see those lines in those. The 1850 census and 1870 census gives you their land ownership. What's the value of their land? You also find the censuses that give you their personal property ownership. Okay. It tells you how they had their house. Did they rent or did they own their residence? You'll see that O or an R. And then the other next column with the more recent ones, you see an M or an F. Did they have a mortgage or were they free of the mortgage? And you also see the indication of the value of their property or their rent. I like doing this with youth because they'll come in and they'll find their great grandparents in the 1940 census, and the rent was $10 a month, and their house was valued at $2,500. You know, and I'm like, well, can you imagine paying rent for $10 a month? So they don't realize what the cost of what that monetary value was back then. And then also they'll indicate whether they have a farm schedule number. And if you can find that farm schedule, that's going to give you a lot of details about what crops were there, how many acres they owned, how many acres were wooded, how many acres were croplands, how many were fallow, how many heads of cattle, how many dozen chickens, how many eggs, butter. A lot of different information is produced in those farm schedules that are very important. We also have the education. And so in the 1840 census, it lists the number of scholars. That means students, but it also lists the number of non-literate and those that cannot read over the age of 20. So it gives you an educational status of the family. When we start getting up into like the 1940 census, it actually lists the last grade they completed. So did they complete 8th grade? Did they complete high school? Did they complete college? And we can see, you know, how many people can read in that household, how many people can't read, and so on. As well as employment. They just did the two columns. In some of the other earlier censuses, it'll list specific industries. So it's just agriculture, commerce, navigation, and so on. Again, you don't see those very often, okay? But they're specific to the location. If you're in West Virginia, they may highlight mining. If you're in New England, they may highlight navigation. So it'll be specific to the location. In between 1850 and 1940, they list the occupation of individuals over 15. And in 1950, it was occupation of individuals over 14. So you can see if the children are working. And then this also helps you look for agricultural schedules or manufacturing schedules that might be relevant to those families. You can also find their employment status. Were they a pauper or a convict? Okay, indicating that they were not employed. How many months were they unemployed? How many weeks were they unemployed? What was their average weekly hours? You know, did they work 40-hour a week? Did they work 60-hour weeks? The 1940 census asked how much money they made in 1939. So you can see what their average annual income was. You know, did they make $1,200 or did they make $2,000 a year? You know, you can see how your family related to those others in that community. Were they well off in that community, or were they about average or lower than average within that community? And we can also get their addresses. So between 1880 and 1950 census, it lists the street names and house numbers. And I like to use that information and go on Google Maps, especially if I'm working with somebody that's just found their information on the census. And I'm like, okay, let's see if that house is still there. So we'll take that address, we'll go into Google Street View, we'll see if the house is there. I'll go into Zillow, one of the real estate websites, see when that house was constructed. We'll go into the the property appraiser's office and see what's information's about that. We can also find the enumeration districts for those towns. So here's an example. This is my great-grandfather's house at 104 South Frankfurt Street. 1930 census lists that as his address. One thing to notice is when the house was built. The house was built in 1927. So if he's living there in the 1930 census, he's probably the first owner of that house. And then we can look at the enumeration districts. So I've given a couple links here. The National Archives has enumeration maps, as well as Steve Morris's website. And if you're on Steve Morris's website for the 1940 and 1950 enumeration districts, you just put in the date for the census, the state, the county, and the enumeration district, and it'll give you these maps. So you'll notice I did enumeration district 614, and that ends up in Minster, Ohio. That's a community with a lot of houses, but then you see the rural area around it, and you see each black dot is a house. And so you can see where their family lived based on where those black dots are. Also, the early censuses, the 1840 and earlier, we have slavery information in those. They list the number, sex, and age of the slaves that are owned. And the 1850 and 1860 censuses have their own slave schedules with more details. And we can also get an idea of the physical and mental disabilities that might be present. So several of these censuses will list if they're deaf, dumb, or blind individuals. And some other census will list if they're, as they're labeled at that point in time, insane or idiots. Now, the important thing about this is if you know that one of these individuals comes up under one of those categories, you may be able to find the blind school or the deaf school in an area, or you may be able to find an asylum where that individual may have gone to school or may have been placed because the family couldn't handle that handicap at that point in time. So you want to look to see if those records exist for those places. And the 1930 census, was your family a techie? Did they have a radio? Not everybody had radios at that point in time. It was an early technology, but having that information in the census gives you a good idea of where they stood as far as gaining information about the world around them. And you also want to know your boundaries, okay? Counties, state lines change over time. So just because somebody lives in this county today, the family may have never moved, but they might be living in a different county at a previous census record. So I'm going to give you a couple examples here. With Florida, the first census in Florida had 2 counties, Pensacola and Escambia. 1830 and 1840, it was a territory. It had over a dozen counties. And then today it has a lot more than that. So here's the map of Florida. So this is the pink one on the Panhandle area is Escambia County, and then the yellow one is St. Johns County. I like the 1834 map because that long yellow one along the East Coast is Mosquito County. Okay, anybody's been to Florida? There's mosquitoes, yeah. And so Mosquito County became St. John's, Flagler, Volusia, Brevard, Indian River, St. Lucie. And so you have to know when those counties were established when you're looking at the census. Because, for example, if I live in Indian River County, but in the 1920 census, that was St. Lucie County. So I have to know that in order to figure out where the census record was for that time frame. Now, I'm not going to get through all of these slides, but you'll be able to download all of these. These are specifically for what's in an individual census record and what states were there. Okay. So for the 1790 census, you see it had 14 states and territories. They had 2 age classes for males, free males under 16 and over 16. That was it. Then they had the free white male or white females and other free persons, and then slaves. So those are the only columns you're going to see tick marks for in general. But then there may be that additional column where it lists the occupations. So you want to look to see that if that additional column is there. So this is an example of the 1790 census. You see the names, you see the under 16, over 16, free females, others, and then the last column there for its number of slaves. Again, you only have the head of households in this record. Between 1800 and 1810, they have a lot more age classifications. So you see all of the different age classifications for males and females, as well as other free persons, and then slaves and the occupations. And we've got more states here in this set of records. And so this is what that census would look like. You see a lot more columns. You have to remember what is in each of those columns. So what I always do is I always print up the template. And I have the template sitting there, and then I can fill in the name, and then I can put the tick marks in where they belong, and I can see where the individuals sit in that family. In the 1820 census, you see we have even more age classes. Now, the important thing here is some of these age classes get much smaller than they were in the previous ones. So now you're restricting your age classes down a little bit. But we have a little bit of a problem with this census in that there's a free white males 16 to 18 and a free white males 16 to 26. So if you have one tick mark in there and one tick mark in the other one, that means that individual is 16 to 18 in both of those columns. So don't count him twice. Okay, if you have 1 and 2, then you know that you have one that's 16 to 18 and the one that's over 18. So make sure you're aware of that. Don't count every one of those tick marks and say, I've got 2 when it's actually only 1. And so you can see these are a lot longer in their class in the pages that they have. In 1830, again, we have more age classes, smaller age classes. I like this one because it's the only one that has the age class over 100. So if you have a family member who's in that age class over 100, you want to make sure you figure out who that one is, right? And this one also has age classes for the slaves, as well as the handicapped, deaf, dumb, or blind individuals. Notice that as we go through these, there's more and more information in each of these censuses, and so each of these slides gets a little bit longer. And the 1840 census, we're up to 30 states and territories now. And, you know, as I mentioned previously, the 1840 census includes those Revolutionary War pensioners and has their names included into it. We also see more detailed occupational information, different trades, which may have their own documentation associated with them that you might find more information in those. The 1850 census, this is the first one where you have everybody listed in that census. And so we can see individual information and be able to track that. This is also one of those censuses where we have a mortality schedule as well as a slave schedule. So if your individual died within the year, the mortality schedule should have their name in it, and it should have details about their death, the cause of death. So here is the 1850 census. And again, we've got the individuals grouped into households. We've got their occupations. We've got their property values, their place of birth, and other information such as that. And so when we look at these mortality schedules and these slave schedules, we get a lot more information. So we can see if the families own slaves, how many slaves that they own, how many people might have died in that community within the last year. Maybe there was a cholera epidemic or a yellow fever epidemic or something like that, and you'll be able to see a large number of individuals dying because of that disease. So it's always good that if you don't understand what that disease is, because it's using a historic name, you might want to look that up online and see what was the cause of death. Here's the 1860 census. Again, very similar to the 1850 census, and again, has the mortality schedule and slave schedule associated with it. This one here will let us know if the person was married within the last year also. And it gives us the personal property as well as the real estate property values. And then the 1870 census. So again, notice how these territories are changing, the boundaries are changing. So if I had somebody that I was doing research on and lived in 4 different counties and never moved. So you have to track those county boundaries and those state boundaries. So this census gives us the voting rights, tells us whether males over 21 age could vote or could not vote. So there might be a reason why they could not vote. You might want to look that up. Maybe they had some criminal history, or maybe they didn't pay their taxes, or some sort of information that might be relevant to your research. Here's the 1880 census. Again, this is a good one. It usually will give you the house number and street name, so you can do some research on that. It'll give you the number of months that they were unemployed during that year, whether they were temporarily disabled or sick. And then this is the first one that will give us the place of birth of the parents. It's also the last mortality schedule and the first time the Indian schedule was done. So this is, like I said, we can use Zillow, Google Maps, Google Street Views, and so on to find information. The 1890 census, almost all of it's destroyed, but there is an 1890 Union veteran schedule that survives. So if your ancestor was a Union veteran, he would survive in that schedule. However, if it was a Confederate, most likely would not survive in that schedule. There are some cases where enumerators did put Confederate veterans in the enumeration, so you could find them. This is, as I said, this is a very detailed one. It includes 30 questions per person. So a lot of information if you ever saw one of these. This is an example of the 1890 census. You see each person has a column, and that column goes straight down on the front and then straight down on the back with 30 questions. And you can see each state, which counties still exist for those states. Hamilton County is Cincinnati, Ohio, but not much. So if you have any family in those counties, check your 1890 census. So again, the 1900 census is when we start seeing the naturalization or immigration status. If they're alien, first papers are naturalized. It tells us if they owned or rented the home, if they lived on a farm or they lived in a home. A lot of good information that you can associate with social history during that period of time. This is also the one that will give us the number of children born and the number of children still living, so we can find those missing children. The 1910 census, we're up to 46 states and territories now. Okay, and so this one gives us their employment status and how many weeks they were unemployed, if they were a survivor of the Civil War. And it gives us a number of children again in this census record. So it's a very good record, it has a lot of information in it. We have the 1920 census. This one gives us the name of the employer or if they're self-employed. So you'll see that little code in there. And this one here is the first one to officially include Native Americans or Indians in the official federal census, not in their own separate schedule. So the information, the employment information could include the company name. It can include the industry type. And if you find that information, you know, maybe some of these communities have different record sets that associate with those industries. So, you know, maybe it's mining, maybe it's coal mining or something of that sort. So you can find mining records that might be able to give you more information. The 1930 census. Again, as I mentioned, do they own a radio? What was their age at first marriage, their veteran status, and the value of their home or their rent? And so in this census, there were 12 million people in the United States that had radios. So if your family had a radio, they were one of the few people that had radios at that point in time. And this was just mainly to track the leap of that technology. You know, if more people are getting radios, then we need to make sure we're putting out more radio stations where we're providing that information. And then we have the 1940 and 1950 census, and this is where the Hawaii Territory and Alaska Territory were included, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, Samoa, Panama Canal Zone. And that was the last of the censuses that was released. So how many people here did indexing on the 1950 census? So a good number of you. So they indexed that one pretty quickly, didn't they? So with the handwriting recognition and the AI, that was very quickly done. Most of us were just in there verifying that the AI was doing it correctly. We get a lot of information in these censuses, you know, their ages, relationships, marital status, employment status, income, education. So a lot of that information is valuable information to build the history, build the stories around your people. You know, so when we start looking at censuses, a lot of people just look at the name, age, and date and place, and don't bother to look at all of those other bits of information. There are some other census forms that you'll probably never see. So there's the 1950 census cruise of vessels. So if your ancestor was on a vessel, was in the shipping industry or something like that, there is this vessel crew list that there's a special part of the census. And a lot of information is on those. Maybe you might be able to find a few. They're not very easy to find. The back page of the 1950 census is totally missing. They only microfilmed the front pages of the census. If you look at the back page, you see there's a lot of information here. This includes, did they have electricity, indoor plumbing? What type of house did they have? Was it a brick house? Was it a wood frame house? All of these bits of information would have been great to have, but they microfilmed the front page and then they destroyed the rest of the record. So you'll never find, I won't say you'll never find, somebody might have kept a page, but you'll never find them online. You also have the infant cards. And so these infant cards were for the children that were born between January and March of 1950. And so it includes all of the information about the name of the infant, the address, the hospitals, and various bits of information that would be helpful if those forms still existed. But those have all been destroyed also. So when we look at the census records, we want to look at all of the details. We want to understand what all of those details mean. You want to look at the enumerator's instruction manual and go through that. And the instruction manual are over 100 pages in many cases. So it'll tell you, how did they go around the block? Did they go to the corner, make a right-hand turn, go down to the next one, make a right-hand turn? Did they go back and forth? You know, knowing that will tell you, because it says, you know, house visited, family visited. And so that'll give you an idea of where you're looking at in relationship to the other homes. Understanding the codes. So a lot of the more recent censuses have statistical codes in them. The last 40 slides of this presentation give you instructions on the 1950s, the codes. So it's very helpful if you're doing that to look through what those codes mean. And I'll maybe show a couple of those slides before we end here. On the handout, I've listed a bunch of sources. Just for information, I am the education director for the Family History Guide. You'll see our booth down on the northern end of the expo hall here. And our website is educational website. It helps people learn how to use different record types or do different research. And so we have a complete lesson plan on the census records that you can go through and figure out how to read the census records. The National Archives has great information. Family Search Wiki, you know, I always tell people, look up the Family Search Wiki, find what you're looking for there, understand what it means. The IPUMS does statistical analysis on the census records. So you can go back and see what a community's occupations were, what the makeup of that community was based on those records. And then Steve Morris has great information about the coding. So if you have any questions, you can, you know, ask me the questions, and I have some contact information there. Again, these are all on the slides if you want to download them later. Also, if you want, you can give session feedback on the app, and you just click on the session feedback, provide information. There's also join the discussion. And so if you have any questions that you see later on during RootsTech, you can still post those questions there, and I will get to those. And I just want to show you real quick. There's this bonus material, in-depth look at 1940s and 50s censuses, and it goes line by line of the census, and it tells you how to read those codes. So again, another 40 slides or so there that you can access. So I guess we're ready for questions.
Excuse me, I got it.
What was that?
How do they access the bonus material?
Oh, yeah. So the bonus material is on the downloads to those slides. So if you go to the presentation on the RootsTech app, it'll have the slides and the syllabus for download.
What are first papers?
What's that?
What are first
Oh, the
papers?
first paper. So that's their intent, the declaration of intent. So they've submitted their intent to be naturalized. That's the first papers. And then you'll see the process go through until they get to the naturalization paper at that point. It depends, but I think it's like 5 years after they become a citizen, or after they come to the U.S., after the immigration, they can file their first papers. Yeah, then it's a couple years for the naturalization. Yep. Okay.
Could you just explain what enumeration district is?
Yeah, so the enumeration district is the area where the enumerator worked. So you'll see a county or a township, and then that'll be divided into enumeration districts. You'll see that usually up in the upper corner of the census, and it'll have who the enumerator was for that district. So if you can find the enumeration maps for that area, it'll actually specifically outline what streets were incorporated into that district.
Thank you. Do you know when or if they're going to digitize the 1960 and on census?
72 years, so it would be 1932. Well, it has to be 72 years after the census was taken before they can release it. So yeah, 1922. Or I'm sorry. 2022 was when we got the 1950 census. The 60 census will be in 2032. Yeah. So any more in-person questions? Do we have any online questions?
We do have some online questions. One is there a chart that summarizes the information for each census?
So each census, you can find the templates online. Family Search has them, Ancestry has them, other places have the templates, which basically just gives you a blank of the census, and you can fill in the information there with your family's information. So you can see what each column means. It's a lot easier reading them off those blank templates than it is trying to read them off the census record.
Another question, I'm wondering how an apprentice would be recorded. My great-great-grandfather was an apprentice and was taken from one state to another, all prior to 1850.
Yeah, so prior to 1850, you're just going to have those tick marks. So unless he was within one of those industries that were specifically highlighted in the census record, there probably won't be any indication of his apprenticeship on the census record itself.
Another question, if you know your ancestor was in the War of 1812, how can you tell this info about them in the census?
So the 1812 census was not highlighted in the census records. Remember, I said that the Revolutionary War was an 1840 census. And then in the 1900s, they start indicating all of the other battles. So the person that was in the War of 1812 would not have shown up in the 1900 census, most likely.
Says, I'm having a difficult time finding history on my biological grandfather. He died in Salt Lake, and anything after him is blank. Do you recommend census searches to try and find light to his ancestors?
The one thing we have to realize on census records are every 10 years. There's a lot that happens between those 10 years. I would try looking for local records, the voting records, the tax records, land records, to see if he shows up in those. Because a lot of stuff's going to happen in between those 10 years on the census that you might find better information on.
My great-grandmother married twice. Some of her stepchildren identified her as their mother, but it was another woman. How can I verify which children she actually had?
That's where you're going to have to use supplemental information. So you're going to have to see if there's any, death records for those children listing their parents. Birth records, marriage records, which may list the parents. Those records, I had a set of census records where the husband married two women named Elizabeth. Elizabeth died, then he married another wife, Elizabeth, and so all the children, they had Elizabeth as their mother. So it made it a little more difficult until I found those supplemental records, the marriage, death, and birth records that had the actual names for the mothers.
So where would we go to find the voting records and tax records?
Yeah, so the talk I gave yesterday, it's online. You can watch that. But I recommend Family Search because they have a large number of voting records and tax records available. Ancestry also has a good collection. All of the slides that I did for the presentation yesterday were from Family Search. And I walked through the process of locating using the different search techniques in Family Search, how to find those records.
Again, from online, is there a source for colonial county borders and descriptions?
So I would believe so. And what I generally use, I use a website, and I for some reason, I can't remember the website right now, but it has animated maps of the county borders. And so you can type in the state, and it starts at the beginning of that state, and it shows the year by year how the boundaries of those counties changed. And as they change, it'll list at the bottom what year they became and what counties they developed out of or became later. So I just can't remember the name of the page right now.
Okay. Another question, I have seen microfilm with the date 1970 on it. Were some of the 1970 schedules released?
I don't know. I would say no, but somebody might have had some copies. I don't think they would have been, though, because of the privacy rules for the United States. They should be 72 years for the census records.
Is there a way to find current addresses for old route box addresses found in the census?
Oh, yes, because when I grew up, I was in a rural district or rural fire district or something like an RFD number. Yeah, and I don't know of any way to convert that because that was a district number and the mailman just knew your name and delivered it to your house. So I can't tell you if you might find a map with the district on it and that'll give you an idea what streets were in that district, but I don't know beyond that.
Are there any census type records before 1780?
Not U.S. federal censuses. So there may be state or local censuses that might have been done. But that would be, up to that location. So you would be, pre-colonial or you'd be colonial period. And I don't know specifically on those.
The night.
I have seen some state census records.
Right.
How many states did that?
Yeah. So on Family Search, you can actually get a list of the state censuses and what years they were, and then compare that to when the federal censuses were. Generally, a state census was in the 1 year or the 5 year. So the federal censuses were in the 0 years. So like 1870 would be the federal, 1871 might be a state, or 1875 might be a state. Not every state did a state census though. So it's limited to the numbers, and it's limited. Each state would not have done it every 10 years either. So some of them did them on different years each time, or they may have only done it 3 or 4 times in their history. But that table on Family Search Wiki would give you that information.
Military districts for military personnel in the Philippines, Guam, are they included in the census records now?
Yes. So you'll find military census records where they did censuses on the bases. Those are there. You'll have to look them up. But the Philippines did have territorial census records for the U.S. at one time. Yes.
From online. How far back can you find enumeration district information, for example, maps?
So you want to look from the census first. If the census doesn't list an enumeration district, you're not going to find one. So the 1850 census, or 1840 census doesn't have a enumeration district on it. 1910 census has one on there. So the 1940 and 50 enumeration districts are easy to find. You may have a little more difficulty finding some of the later ones, and I'd have to do a little research to figure out where they were.
What's the best source for census information for Native Americans?
So you have the Indian schedules that were done, as I mentioned, but only 40,000 Indians were listed in those census records. That was not all of them. So in some cases, the tribes had already basically allowed the United States to be the constitutional government for them. And so they would be on the standard roll, the standard federal census. If the tribe was independent, they would be on the rolls.
Okay. And finally, the 1900 shows my ancestor was foreign-born, Ireland, but there are no indications of first papers or naturalization. Is this common?
So first of all, if the ancestor was female, they would probably not have naturalization records because they became naturalized with their spouse. The husband may or may not have done naturalization papers, may have just retained his citizenship and declined the right to vote. So it could be common in an area where it might be a cultural thing for that area. It might be the Irish decided they just didn't want to assimilate into the local society and they just didn't do the naturalization.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay.
So if a woman was naturalized with her husband, would that only apply to those who were married before they immigrated?
So no. This is the interesting thing. And if you look at my voting records, talk just a little bit about that. so a woman, if she was married to an American citizen and she was an immigrant, her citizenship was there. She didn't have voting rights or anything like that. If she was married to a naturalized citizen, she basically was naturalized. She still didn't have the rights of a citizen. If she was married to an American-born citizen, he died, and then she married an immigrant, she would then lose those rights until he got the naturalization. So it's the back and forth, and it's a little confusing when you start looking at some of these.
Can I ask you? So let's say theoretically somebody's grandmother came as a stowaway from Italy, grandfather came legally and was on the ship's register, married once they were here. I can't find any naturalization papers on her.
No, she won't. She won't have naturalization papers.
Was she a citizen, a U.S. citizen eventually?
The men were naturalized. The women just became.
Even though they were married after
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
here. Okay.
And when I say became, it's very loosely became, So
Okay.
they didn't need to be naturalized. And many of them didn't even get naturalized. And even when the Voting Rights Act came in place for women, the 19th Amendment, because they didn't feel they wanted to vote. And so they just didn't even bother. If you wanted to vote, then you had to get your citizenship or prove that you were married to an American citizen.
Thank you.
Okay. No other questions? Great. Well, I appreciate everybody. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. You have my contact information, and make sure you download the records or the slides as well as the syllabus afterwards. Thank you.